Now, the UN Security Council has adopted a resolution endorsing a ceasefire proposal announced by President Biden. The resolution calls on Hamas to accept the three-phase plan aimed at ending the 8-month war in Gaza. 14 Security Council members supported the proposal, with only Russia abstaining. The resolution urges Israel and Hamas to fully implement the terms of the deal without delay or condition. The proposal includes a permanent end to hostilities, the return of Israeli hostages, and a major multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza. Let's get more from our Washington correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez Gruber. Welcome, Ben. What will this Security Council vote mean in practical terms?
So this resolution welcomed this three-phase ceasefire plan that President Biden laid out 2 weeks ago. And the resolution also goes into detail about this proposal. It spells out that, and I quote, if the negotiations between Israel and Hamas take longer than 6 weeks for phase one, that's before they come to the next one, the ceasefire will still continue as long as negotiations between both parts continue. There were some amendments to a previous version of this Gaza ceasefire draft resolution. Well, the current draft now categorically says Israel accepted the deal. The previous one only said that the deal was acceptable to Israel. So a slight change there, as we know that for months negotiators from the US, Egypt and Qatar have been trying to mediate a ceasefire, and now, as you said, 14 out of 15 members of the UN Security Council approved it.
Now, President Biden's neck and neck with Donald Trump in the race for the White House. How important is it for President Biden to get this deal done?
For him, it's very important because pro-Palestinian protesters are indeed a very common sight at events that President Biden or Vice President Harris attend. Even though he was not here in Washington, D.C., because he was in Europe and France only last week, and several organizations surrounded the White House with a long red banner. They wore red. They called it the People's Red Line in reference to the red line that President Biden promised for a wider ground offensive by Israel in the southern Gaza city of Rafah, and that, according to the organizers that came from several U.S. cities for the protests here in D.C., is nowhere to be seen. So pressure within the Democratic Party is definitely growing, and that's something that we can also see for the upcoming visit of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Next month, he will give a speech before a joint meeting of Congress, and there are more progressive Democrats emerging that say that they will not attend in protest.
OK, thanks for that, Ben. Benjamin Alvarez Gruber in Washington. Now, the US Secretary of State is back in the Middle East, pushing for the ceasefire in Gaza that President Biden presented to the world last month. Antony Blinken held talks in Cairo with Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who's been a key mediator with Hamas, before travelling on to Israel. There, he's meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. This is Mr. Blinken's 8th trip to the region since the conflict broke out in October. Before heading for Israel, he delivered a clear message for the warring parties and for the wider region.
My message to governments throughout the region, to people throughout the region, is if you want a ceasefire, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to alleviate the terrible suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, press Hamas to say yes. If you want to get all the hostages home, press Hamas to say yes. The only party that has not accepted, the only party that's not said yes, is Hamas. That's who everyone's waiting on. That's who the Palestinians in Gaza are waiting on. It's who the Israelis are waiting on. It's who the hostages and the hostage families are waiting on. It's who the entire region and the entire world is waiting on. And so we'll see. Does Hamas want to end this conflict, end this war that it started, or not? We'll find out. But it's clear that virtually the entire world has come together in support of the proposal. And the only open question is, will Hamas...
Let's take a closer look at this with journalist Sami Sockol in Jerusalem. Welcome back to DW, Sami. We've just heard Antony Blinken telling the world to press Hamas to say yes to this latest ceasefire deal. Has Israel said yes yet?
Well, that's a very good question. If you heard the speech given by Benny Gantz yesterday, he urged upon Netanyahu to be courageous and accept this deal. And in fact, there is a deal that has been accepted by Netanyahu and by the war cabinet. And the details of this deal were actually exposed today to the Israeli public. This deal is very similar to what we heard from Biden himself. But immediately after Biden's speech, there was a pressure from the Israeli right, the far right-wing parties that are saying that they will resign from the government if this deal will go ahead. And Netanyahu, so it seems, has changed the language. And he has been claiming that Israel would be able to continue the war after the first stage. But in the deal that was exposed on Channel 12 today, it actually says that the ceasefire, or as it's called here, the temporary cessation of military operations by both sides, should continue throughout this period.
Okay, so there is at the very least some sort of movement, because this is the Secretary of State's, I think, 8th tour of the Middle East without deals, but he can go back to Washington saying there is some movement.
Yeah, well, there is a deal on the table, and there is, I can say, on the Israeli side, public support for this deal. Another network has announced that in a poll that they conducted, 49% of the public supports such a deal, as opposed to only 32% of the public who are against. And this deal talks clearly about, as the way it was presented to the public, as a deal that would bring about a ceasefire and the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners in return for the release of the Israeli hostages. So the Israeli public is willing to pay the price. We also see it in the Israeli parliament. There's an overwhelming support for this kind of a deal. If we look at the government, we see that the ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas, and Agudat Israel, United Torah Judaism, they support it. But the problem is that the far right and Netanyahu have not come out to support this.
OK. And now that Benny Gantz has resigned, as he did over the weekend, does that mean that Mr Netanyahu is even more beholden now to the right-wing elements of the government?
Yes, indeed. This is the situation. It seems that Netanyahu had a choice. He could have tried to appease Gantz and made him stay with him together, but he decided rather to be on the same page together with the far right in his government. And in that way, he's actually closing the door on a possibility for a ceasefire. These right-wing, far right-wing parties, they talk about settling the Gaza Strip with Jewish settlements. And they're totally against any kind of compromise and release of Palestinian prisoners.
OK, so we've got differing forces, haven't we? You said there was momentum for this deal. Benny Gantz leaving the government strengthens the hand of the right wing, who are very much anti this deal. Is Mr Gantz's departure likely to make any difference to the way that Benjamin Netanyahu prosecutes this war?
Well, what we expect now is actually more of the same. Had Gantz stayed in the government, then we would have probably gone towards a direction of a ceasefire, a prisoner swap, and if that would happen, maybe there would have been also some kind of agreement with Lebanon, Hezbollah, and so forth, and being on board with the American regional plans. and so forth. But since Gantz is out, it seems that Netanyahu will be pushing for more of the same, which means more of the military campaign inside the Gaza Strip.
Let's talk about another big event that happened this weekend, which was the freeing of 4 Israeli hostages at the cost of hundreds of Palestinian lives. And before the Israeli army managed that, Benjamin Netanyahu was suffering a lot of criticism for appearing to prioritise a military victory over Hamas above freeing the hostages. Has this rescue quietened those criticisms?
Well, this rescue, though it was very popular with the Israeli public, at the end of the day, doesn't really change the big picture. The big picture is that there are 120 hostages inside the Gaza Strip. Some are not among the living, but nevertheless, once the Israeli public saw these hostages coming out, the feeling is that there are hostages that are alive inside, in spite of the war, in spite of everything, they're still alive and inside. So this is actually strengthening the public in its yearning for the release of hostages. And I wouldn't be surprised that it strengthens those who say that there has to be a kind of a deal, because the military itself is saying that they will not be able to make more operations like this. They know that Hamas will use different methods. They know that next time when there'll be Israeli forces coming, they could execute the hostages, or they could take other measures so as to prevent these operations. So this was a kind of a spectacular show that we saw, which was successful from the Israeli point of view. But no one really thinks that this is a solution for the rest of the hostages.
Can we speculate and look forward now to months or perhaps years after this war is over, whatever that might look like? It might look like a protracted state of not firing, or there may actually be a deal. But I wonder just about the damage that this war has done to Israel's place in international affairs. When this is done, does Israel just slot back into the international community as though the war in Gaza didn't happen, or does it not care about what the world thinks, so long as the United States has its back?
Look, if you look at the Israeli public and even some of the reactions from the foreign ministry today, there was some kind of relief when they saw the rise of the right wing and the populist far-right parties in Europe that indicate that those who are the supporters of the Palestinian cause on the left, they suffered a political blow. So this is actually considered as something, a positive development. And the same thing in the United States. The polls are showing that Donald Trump could be the next president. And definitely he is someone that Netanyahu and his party are counting on. So there's always the belief that there are other political forces that could be Israel's allies in any continuous war situation.
Fascinating analysis. Good talking to you as ever, Sami. Sami Sockol in Jerusalem. Thank you so much.